Hey guys, today on The Open Book, we'll be discussing the Singapore general elections and some ideas and possible questions we have about the election. So, first up, I think the first topic on the agenda would be an issue of character versus efficacy in politics. And a bit of background on this agenda. Recently, a PAP candidate by the name of Ivan Lim came out as a new candidate. However, quite a lot of backlash came from people who had prior interactions with him, and so a debate rose about the need for a politician to be friendly and have a clean background versus his result oriented policy. Does anyone have any opinion on this?
Yeah, I think perhaps Singaporeans, much like Malaysians, are less concerned about efficacy in politics in terms of like human rights issues or foreign policy when they vote. Obviously, I'm not Singaporean, so I can't say from personal experience, but I know that in Malaysia, the mass population is more likely to care about internal, like domestic policies and identity politics, especially in Malaysia with like Chinese, Indian, Malay, sorry, and plus I think I also thought that the voting age in Singapore is 21, which means the majority of those voting will be people who were alive since before Singaporean independence, right? So perhaps most of the voting pool would feel like a sense of like a feeling patriotic because like for PAP because they were like the government that was there that brought them out, that was like there since 1965. So yeah, that's what I think.
I feel like that's a problem, and that's an argument that I don't really buy into. Like a lot of people say that, oh, the PFP have been so successful for X, Y, and Z years. They've been doing X, Y, and Z so well, and so we should just keep on voting them in. I feel like that just leads to complacency, and every single election should be a new mandate for them, and they should work just as hard and not rely on past results. Sure it helps, and the thing is, the Singapore elections, I think, is unique in that no one disputes what the PAP has done, right? Even if you're a crackhead opposition, there is no way you can dispute what the PAP has done. Right now, what the opposition are selling is that the PAP will continue being the ruling majority party. No one disputes that. But there is a need for opposition to act as a check and balance, and it's a spur, like in the height of the PAP, that will just push for better policy and better results.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that reminds me of like the 2018 Malaysian election as well. Like the need for checks and balances for UMNO, like in Malaysia, for example, with PH like being the government and stuff like that. So yeah, I do think if like the opposition wins, which I don't know, do you think they have a chance? Because from what I've read, it seems like they don't.
They don't. It's zero. Like they will never get majority.
Yeah, exactly. So, but the thought of them winning would definitely put the PAP at a place when they're like, okay, right, we need to think more about how we're gonna approach this, our population, and like the types of messages we want to put out, the types of policies we want to implement, all of that. And I completely agree with you saying like they can't be too complacent, all that.
Yeah, I think this reminds me of a talk that we had, I think maybe 6 weeks ago. And when we were reading Sapiens, we talked about the concept of what would happen if humans lived forever. And I mean, you can sort of relate that onto this in the sense that because, this majority party almost feels invincible and they sort of know that there's no one chasing them, they don't really have an incentive to keep moving forward and keep doing something that keeps them in that space. Sort of like when we were having our argument about, what would it be like for a human to live forever? You wouldn't have any incentive because, you would keep on living, just like how in this scenario, majority party would keep being in their space. So in a way, knowing that there's someone behind you, knowing that your place isn't necessarily going to be as consistent as you think, sort of adds an incentive, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think we're already seeing a lot of the complacency that people are worried about, right? So one of the background reading that we did was about the case of the reserve presidential election.
Mm. Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
then therein lies a huge conundrum whereby the ruling party literally had the power to rewrite the constitution and pass it because they had supermajority to allow for their own election and for it to be a walkover because they decided to bar and not allow any other candidates to fight.
Mm.
And you've got many other examples of basically gaps in the PAP as a result of their complacency. So everything from like undermining of constituency and parliamentary systems all the way to like most recently they released a response, and in the analogy there was an analogy about a abusive husband.
Sorry, can you repeat that? I don't understand. So the analogy to compare the abusive
No,
husband
no,
to
no,
what?
no. So the an opposition. This requires more background reading, but in simple form,
Mm.
an opposition member basically did a loaded question, which basically meant that either way the PAP answered, the opposition would win and prove his point, right?
Mm.
And so
Okay.
then the PAP response to that was to use the analogy of an abusive husband. And if he were to say that he didn't beat his husband, that means you won by getting him not to agree to beat. As in, sorry, if he
Oh,
agreed not to beat his wife, then you would have won by getting him to agree and promise not to beat his wife. But at the same time, if he said that he wouldn't, then you would have won because then he publicized that he would beat his wife.
right.
Yeah,
Okay.
and the thing is,
Okay.
the analogy works fine, right? But the problem was, why are you talking and why are you undermining domestic abuse?
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
like, there are really a lot of like gaps and errors, like really basic errors that just has arisen out of the PAP's complacency.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think with like the younger, Singaporean youth becoming older, coming closer to the age of voting, um, it would definitely like serve as I think would contribute to the whole checks and balances thing, because I think the youth often have like very different perspectives to like the older generation and are more keen um to hold the government accountable.
Yeah, I think we're also seeing a huge shift, especially in the younger generation. One of the biggest problem was I think it's been consistent throughout past elections, but I think it's been addressed and raised quite a bit in this election, is the power that the PAP has in airdropping their chosen candidates,
Mm.
and the standard of these candidates are that they come from quite elite backgrounds.
Mm.
So they often come from the top schools in Singapore, and then they go on to either be generals in the army or high-ranking executives in Singapore, government-owned or linked corporations, and then they get airdropped into politics. So there's a
Mm.
really big gray area between army, private, and then politics. And so more and more Singaporeans are becoming aware of this and wary about how elite the possibility of like elitism within the ruling party and their inability to understand and feel for the.
Working class,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Mm. Understandable. Yeah, I mean, yeah, well, that reminds me of like Najib, I guess, and how he was the sixth prime minister, right? And he's the son of Tun Abdul Razak, who was the second prime minister of Malaysia. So he was kind of like born and bred into politics and all of that.
Yeah, Morgan's really quiet.
Yeah, I guess what happened with that when you have this leader, who's always had a silver spoon, there's just a complete lack of sympathy for anyone who's in the lower classes, I guess. And I mean, if you look over in the US, at Trump, even his father, Fred Trump, he was, a rich person as well. And so Trump, he was born into this family of constantly marginalizing the people that were lower than him. So I guess, I mean, that just explains why now Trump has such a low, sense of respect for, all these minority groups and so on, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Also to add to that, being a politician isn't like whoa. Wait, I lost my train of thought. Oh, okay. Being a politician isn't cheap in the first place, like to run for MP and stuff, and you know, you need money for your campaign and all of that. So I think that's already kind of gatekeeping others who are less financially available, I guess, to run and represent their people, perhaps.
Yeah, and not just financial gatekeeping, but there are a lot of systematic, like institutionalized gatekeeping in place, both with the control that the government has over mainstream media, their ability to shape election ruling, their gerrymandering and stuff like that. And that's
Mm,
why we have not seen a single successful independent candidate in Singapore's electoral history.
mm,
Yeah.
definitely. And I guess like people are quite scared of the Singapore government, aren't they?
Yeah,
Um,
there's quite a big rumor going around, and it's been there like every election that there are repercussions for voting opposition, and that the government tracks and knows your vote.
oh wow.
Like
Okay.
it's like, yeah, like I always hear like aunties and like uncles talking about it, like
Mm,
not just my family, but like in the coffee shops and like around the street, that like
mm.
the government controls, not controls, but the government knows and the government's aware, and it's almost like a big brother kind of thing, and that there are
Yeah.
consequences, be it like when you want to apply for government loan, government housing, or like a government job.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, going back to the well, the heading for this what we're discussing, character versus efficacy, right? I think in well, actually, I don't want to generalize, but I think in Singapore, for example, it's very much, from what I gather, character is more important than efficacy, right? And like in Malaysia too, like to draw a parallel back in 2018, I think the reason the opposition won is because the main goal was just kind of to oust Najib, like just to take remove him from power. And of course, like sure, people read like the 100 days promise of Pakatan Harapan and like all everything they were saying and all of that, but the main goal was just to dismantle Najib's party. And then as soon as people knew Pakatan Harapan was more liberal, people knew Pakatan Harapan wanted to diversify the like you know, having more like people from Chinese and Indians in parliament, all of that, and like there were hints that they were pro LGBT and all that, which is obviously like really it's something that Malaysians generally are very like anti against. And then as soon as PH was in power, and then I think news leaked out. Like, there's this guy called Numana Fifi, who's like the our previous sports and youth minister's best friend, or like some best friend, and also someone in his office. There were like rumors that he was gay and all that, and everybody just like straight up went like no PH anymore. Like started not supporting them and all of that. So I think in 2018 in Malaysia, it was very much about character over efficacy, and I think it's kind of the same with Singapore right now.
I think I would argue the opposite actually, that
Oh, really?
Singaporeans don't necessarily care about a candidate history and his background as much as their tying of his party PAP with their successors. So I think a
Mm-hmm.
lot of candidates are, they don't vote for the individual and they don't vote for their constituency. They vote
Mm-hmm.
for a bigger picture, which is the PAP as a government of the whole Singapore and the ability to create effective policies. So I think a
Right.
lot of discussions that I've read online and I've been in has been that
I
there is,
think in
sorry,
yes, no.
I'll just finish and then you can add on.
Yeah.
I think for a lot of people in Singapore, there is a difference between a micro versus a macro view. Micro, which is what the member of parliament is doing for my immediate neighborhood and constituency, versus his ability as being a part of the PAP and governance of Singapore as a whole. So I would argue that in Singapore, there's more focus on nationwide efficacy as a result of the PAP being the majority government versus a micro view of your MP and his character and his ability.
Yeah, I was just saying, I absolutely think you're right. And again, if we look over at the US, I mean, that might be a reason why Trump actually won. I mean, if we look at the character of Trump, he's an absolute, yeah. And I was looking at this article last week, and what was happening was these people, they were going around and they were having like, they were looking into homes of middle class US families who actually voted for Trump. And they were like asking questions in terms of why they would actually vote for Trump, and the whole aim was to actually see if they were aware of what of things that Trump says, of the fact that he's misogynistic and he's all kinds of things. And what actually came out was that these families that voted for Trump said, yes, we're completely aware, we know he's not a good person, however, in terms of what he can bring, in terms of the things that can come out of him as a leader, such as lower income tax for our family, and lots of things as well like that. That would be good. I mean, we acknowledge the fact that his character isn't amazing, but in terms of what he can actually do for us, you would just have to leave that out. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So John,
Sorry, go on.
sorry.
Oh,
John, would you think? Oh, after you, yeah.
Okay. No, I was just gonna say that I agree with Sham, but I also think that Trump very much sticks to like the Republican brand and what they stand for, which is I think where he gets a lot of voters as well. So I think the character is part of it, like for people who resonate with him, I guess, like resonate with his character.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that to a large extent, because I feel like in most countries, in terms of general elections, whatever, the strong figurehead in the run up to the election has the power to coerce, as such, if that's quite a cynical term to describe it, or manipulate the people into actually voting for the party itself. Do you get what I mean, John? Like, as in, Donald Trump was able to influence a large majority based on his character more so than the ideals and the ideology of the party itself. So would you say Singapore, to an extent, is a bit different in that one strong figurehead doesn't have that same power that someone like Donald Trump or Boris Johnson or whatever has the power to do?
I think the difference is that their backgrounds are really different and that they're quite extreme, like extreme characters. Whereas in Singapore, as mentioned earlier, a lot of them come from the same background and they're cut from the same cloth in terms of being from elite background, in terms of schooling, family, social standing, and stuff like that. And also with their affiliation and being a part of the PAP, there's a very tight control of party line. So not just in terms of personal character, but in terms of their dealing professionally as a politician. If you were to analyze the histories of Singapore's vote in parliament, I think there has been only like 2 or 3 times in like the past since Singapore's independence where a PAP candidate has voted differently from what the PAP party whip voted. So there have been 2 times in Singapore's history since independence where a PAP candidate, like a PAP member of parliament, has differentiated from his party. So I think in Singapore, the situation is very different from in the US or in the UK, where they have commanded enough of a personal, individual character and presence to sway the party to follow them. Whereas in Singapore, the party trumps, and so they follow party instead of party following them.
Okay, I like that. Yeah, that makes sense.
Should we move on to the next thing on the agenda?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so it's that I think a lot of Singapore prides itself on a kind of meritocratic nature, which is basically awarding and rewarding excellence and results, right? And so because of that, there are, even from education at a young age, there are different streams and avenues and types of schools set up to funnel people through to the very top. There are different levels of education and stuff like that, and different resources available according to your grades and stuff like that. So from a very young age, Singapore prides itself and trains its citizens on a society based on achievements, and so it's quite ironic then that if your government conditions its people to such a way that you then set up ethnic quotas, both in terms of member of parliament and also in terms of a presidential election. So I guess a bigger argument for this would be the presence and the need and reasoning for ethnic quotas, both in politics and in corporations, because you also got private companies that are now increasingly having diversity quotas. Even universities are having diversity quotas for their intake. So I guess that's just a bigger argument.
I think the GRC exists to make sure that there's minority representation, right?
Yeah, so one candidate for the GRC has to be a minority.
Right. I think relying on meritocracy alone may not work, because minority groups are more likely to be underprivileged in the country. Therefore, like having this system where you ensure representation, like ensures that there's someone representing each ethnic group. And then I also think like having a racially balanced parliament is very important to work towards racial harmony and be inclusive to all, especially with like like Singapore is a multiracial country as well. So I think it's a good thing for racial harmony.
I think that's an argument used by the Singapore government that it's for racial harmony and for society, for balance and equality. But the thing is, for me, I think personally, I have my own biases that I'm in general against an ethnic quota, diversity quota, be it for university, be it for private company representation or for politics. So I guess I come from quite a biased view.
How come? What's your reasoning?
I feel like it almost undermines the ability of a person if they are parachuted in just because of a quota. Like, I think even if person A and person B were to be the exact same person with the exact same resume, and you told me that one got in through a quota requirement versus one that got in through his own merit, yeah, so I guess that's where my bias lies in.
Wait, John, can I just clarify this? So you're talking about two constituents here, just hypothetically, two constituents, A and B, and quotas exist in Singapore that mean there has to be a certain number of ethnic constituents to satisfy that said quota. Is that correct?
No, so in Singapore, the two types. Okay, so in your constituency, which is basically the group like neighborhood that you're in charge of, right? So one Singapore has like multiple member of parliament for each individual area, and the areas are split into two types of areas: your SMCs and your GRCs. So your SMC basically means that it's a single seat, so one member of parliament for that one area. Your GRC means multiple member of parliaments for that one area. So it's basically a larger area, and so they have a group of MPs representing and not just one.
Yep.
And so the SMC, there are no ethnic quotas, but for the GRCs, the group one member of every GRC has to be a minority.
Right. Okay, that makes more sense.
Hold on, John. So there's a single seat one, and then there's a multiple seat one.
Yeah, and the multi-seat one requires one minority candidate.
Okay. I think the problem, I think that perhaps if quotas weren't in place, then there might be some like, I don't know how to say it in Singaporean context, but like, I guess in Malaysia, the part that I live in Subang Jaya, and it's mostly like Chinese people here, and then in this neighborhood and like this district, especially like DAP's one in this district for many years, and I think that perhaps not having a quota might result in like racialized comments as to the whole election process, which, I mean, you can't escape that. You can't in Singapore and Malaysia. Like, race will always be in the equation, and it'll always be like UMNO, for example, is very like pro Malay, pro Bumi, and all of that. But I think that perhaps by not like maybe if there wasn't a quota, then people would be more aggressive towards like verbally is what I mean. I don't know. I'm not explaining this very well. I'm really sorry.
I know, I get what you mean. I think the problem with a quota system in that sense, though, John, like if you give the role to someone based on merit and success, who ultimately decides who's like deserved of that success? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, but then I think in the context of politics and in Singapore, then it would be up to the electoral to decide, right?
But surely there would be a prejudice nonetheless. If do you think there would be potentially prejudice that would exist, and then minority groups would have less constituents eventually in government?
Which actually segues to a very, very good point that the government has instituted ethnic quotas, right? But then
Yeah,
multiple high-level ministers and the prime ministers themselves of Singapore have come out and said that Singapore is not ready for a non-Chinese prime minister.
that's interesting.
They've publicly stated that Singapore is not ready for a non-Chinese prime minister. And so I think for me, a bit about that is also that you can't, on one hand, be promoting an ethnic quota, right, and then have a reserved precedent for a specific minority race and then deny them not only from having a quota to the prime minister position, but just outright saying that Singaporeans aren't ready for them.
My take on this is that, well, earlier on, Jonathan, you said that there's a problem with like the parliament being, or like the politicians and people high above being too elitist. And I think by having that GRC system, it ensures that it's like a step towards being less elitist, I guess, because if you don't have if it's based on meritocracy alone, I automatically think, well, maybe I might be wrong, maybe I'm just generalizing, but I automatically think that the people who will have more merits are those who have the resources to like get further education and participate in a lot of I don't know, just political stuff and all of that, which comes with like privilege and all of that. So I guess like the GRC, I feel like the GRC system and the argument against or for elitism kind of has it can go together. And then as for the I can't remember what you said. I can't remember who said it, but you said that someone said Singapore wasn't ready for a non-Chinese prime minister, right? I think. Do you think that stems back to like when Singapore was part of Malaysia and when Malaysia, like I think the Chinese were doing quite well in Malaysia, and the Malays got like cold feet and got scared, and they were employing. They were being horrible to the Chinese and Indians, simply put, and they started putting like pro Bumi, pro Malay policies. So I think, do you think, Jonathan, that legacy has contributed to Singapore saying we're not ready for a non-Chinese prime minister?
I'm not sure about that, but I think for me, a lot of their position on this is stems from their own complacency and their own thinking. I think a lot of policies and rhetoric that they use are quite distanced and differentiated from what like common Singaporeans feel. There's quite a gap between their rhetoric and their arguments and what a normal common Singaporean would feel. So a lot of it is them trying to manipulate and control the politics in Singapore. And I wouldn't be able to comment on the historical context that might have shaped this because I've not read into it enough.
Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts on that, or do you want to move on to the dorm stuff?
I think no, that was insightful on my part. Jeremy explained that pretty well.
But then, do you guys have any idea or like opinion on diversity quotas in like university or jobs? Then, what do you guys think of
Well,
that?
so in Malaysia, like there's UITM, which is like the local university system basically, and there's quotas that are that favor Malay people, and it puts a lot of Chinese and Indian Malaysians at like a place of discomfort, I guess, because like if they go to UIDM, it will be mostly like it's quite weird for them. And okay, UIDM is under Mara, and before I got my scholarship to Marlborough, I was actually in a Mara school called MRSM. It's a local Malay boarding school, and the quota was like mostly Malay, so there was nobody in my year who was not Malay Muslim. In the entire school, the school had like people from 13 to 17, and in the entire school there were only 5 non-Malay Muslims, and they were still like, I mean, I again, this is in a Malaysian context, so I can't equate it to Singapore, but when I was in that school, like the non-Muslims still had to be there for like the Muslim religious lectures that we had every Friday, and they still kind of had to participate in these talks, but then they were told to, oh, just like take the good from it and don't take like the religious aspect from it. And that just never sat well with me. It still doesn't. And with UITM, again, I've never been. I don't know how it is. I don't know if it's the same thing with MRSM, but I think that because of the UITM quotas in Malaysia, a lot of Chinese and Indians and Chinese and Indian Malaysians have had to like, fork out their own money and go to private universities to be more comfortable, I suppose. And in my family, in my extended family, in the older generation, they would all be those people who are like pro Malay universities and stuff like that, which I don't agree with. So yeah, that's my opinion.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I mean, as well as just like schooling and education, I mean, if you look further onto like jobs and so on, I mean, it is a cyclical thing, and let's say we look here in Australia, there is an ethnic quota for the native population, the Aboriginals, and reason for that, I mean, it's to stop this cyclical nature because once you have this certain group, this minority, it's harder for them to get certain jobs, and if they get jobs, it's usually the lower paying jobs, and when they have these lower paying jobs, then that income gets passed on to their family, which means that their family can't afford certain good education, and then because they're not educated well, then when they go and apply for jobs, same thing happens again. They can't get very good jobs, and so it just keeps on happening and happening and happening, right? However, unless you make it, I wouldn't say easier for them to get into the job, but you give them a more straightforward pathway. It's a much more fair route for them to get into that job, and therefore once they're now in a much more higher paying job, they can stop that cycle from happening. They can then afford to send their kids to good education, who can then get good qualifications and get into good jobs. So maybe you have to start by having an ethnic quota in the first place, but I mean from my view it as a much more short-term plan than an actual long-term plan that's just used to stop that cycle from happening.
Sharm,
Yeah.
Take Australia for example. I completely understand the aspect of the Aboriginals and the difficulty in finding jobs, but all of this stems back from education, because if an Aboriginal person doesn't have a good education, they won't be able to have the same qualifications as someone that's been privileged enough to go to a high school or a private school or whatever. And so when they are applying for a job, it's bound to be the candidate that's more qualified, the candidate that's got a better education that's going to get the job. So all of this then surely stems back from education. So if Aboriginal people are integrated into Australian high schools or whatever, then they would be able to, I don't know, convey themselves as a lot more capable than without an education. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. And like, I mean, that's what I was trying to say as well. But I mean, okay, you can't get into a good school if you can't pay for that school. And how do you pay
Oh, yeah, of
for
course.
school? Well, your parents have to earn a certain amount of money so that they can send you. So how do they earn a certain amount of money? They have to get into a good job. And so that's why it's cyclical. It doesn't just start at education. It could also start at jobs. But yet again, it could also start at education. Maybe if you focus on things such as scholarships and like subsidies and so on. But either
Yeah, of
way,
course.
from either end. Know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree with you. Um,
Yeah, actually talking about scholarships, I'm actually like quite curious now about my own scholarship and whether I know that my scholarship isn't just for Bumi Putra people because I know Malaysian Chinese and Malaysian Indians who have gotten scholarships under Khazanah, but I don't know if it's the same for other ones because I know Khazanah is like one of the biggest scholarships you can get in Malaysia, but with the other ones like the National Bank and stuff, I don't know, and I think some scholarships might be pro Bumi only, like for Bumi Putra, so like for Malay Muslims only, which is like which keeps Chinese Malaysians and Malaysian Indians from receiving the same support for education.
I mean, I think Yasmin, it's a difficult one because I don't really know like how to describe it. I think the idea of the Kazan scholarships and scholarships throughout Malaysia are
Yeah.
great. They're obviously they're incredible, and the opportunities that are offered are almost infinite. Do you know what I mean? In a sense, but like, surely Malaysian companies, organizations will be providing scholarships to all of their Malaysian students because in the long run, it's going to benefit Malaysia as a state on the whole. So surely it wouldn't matter really if they were giving it to Chinese Malay, Indian Malay, Malay, just Malay people. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think in the ideal world that I would like to live in, it would be like that. However, there's a lot of identity politics in Malaysia and a lot of like legacy of interracial rioting, like legacy of racism and all of that from the colonial days, and therefore, like I know that some organizing, like Mara, for example, the one that I told you, the school that I was in before Marlborough, was under Mara, and I know Mara does scholarships for university students as well. Like I'd be curious to know if they would have like a 95% Malay Muslim only
Yeah.
quota or something. Because when I was in their school, that was how it was. In like that was the population makeup of their school. So I'd be interested to find out, but I'll do a bit of digging.
John, what's the quotas like in Singapore schools? Like, as in, just local schools, you know?
There is little to no ethnic quotas in schools, but an interesting point about Singapore schools is that for the public ones at least, a lot of your admission is based on your proximity to a certain school.
Okay.
So you've got to live within 1 kilometer of that school to have a higher chance of being accepted by that school. And so this brings up the argument about how like it's a perpetuating cycle of elitism in Singapore because a lot of the top schools in Singapore are in quite expensive neighborhoods. So naturally, based on the 1 kilometer quote unquote quota radius thingy, then a lot of their students will naturally come from well-to-do families, and so it's a perpetuating cycle. We can move on to the next bit, the last bit, since we've got to stop for Sham soon.
Okay, yeah, sure.
And so which is the living standard of dorm workers. So I think the two arguments that are clearest cut to me at least is one that the lives that they have now is much better than that of which they would have in their own country. So regardless of living conditions or wage or job or whatever, right, they're still earning more and living
Right.
better than what they would in their own home country. And
Yeah.
then the opposing argument would be they are still humans, they still deserve a certain level of dignity and respect, and the housing conditions that they are in right now are abhorrent, and it's clear that these conditions played a role in the spreading of the disease.
One of the articles you sent, one of the sentences that like really made me like realize how horrible it was when the government issued face masks to all Singaporeans at the first sign of COVID-19 in early February, migrant workers were excluded. And I thought that that was just really terrible. And again, like you said, probably, well, not probably, definitely contributed to the spreading of the outbreak. And I think it also reminds me of a conversation we had when we discussed our prisons obsolete. Like, I think Morgan, you asked about like racism in Asia towards other Asian countries, and I think this
Mm.
is like a prime example of that.
Oh, of course,
Yeah.
yeah. I think I went to the doctors at the peak of the pandemic. I don't know why, but I did. And there were about 30 migrant workers working outside doing the gardening, and none of them none of them had masks, and then they were all virtually bundled into the back of a convoy truck as such, really tightly crammed together with no masks again. I just think arguably these migrant workers come looking to seek better opportunities, and then they're almost treated subhuman like by the governments of these countries because the government, what federal or state, can just exploit these workers for really, really cheap money and really, really hard labor.
I completely agree. And my grandma actually works at like a mama restaurant. It's just like an Indian Muslim restaurant, and the workers are mostly migrants from India. And one of her workers, he's gone back to India now, but he was someone with an IT like degree in IT, but he couldn't get a job, and he migrated all the way to become a waiter, essentially. And a lot of like the migrant population in Malaysia, and I can't say about Singapore, but maybe it's the same since we're like country neighbors. So a lot of them, not I don't know if it's a lot because I haven't looked at the statistics, but I suspect like quite a few migrant workers who come here doing domestic work, doing quite basic work, actually on paper, like some of them have higher qualifications, but they just weren't able to get jobs in whatever countries they're from, and and I think that's just horrible. Yeah.
I think in Singapore, in Malaysia, I think a lot of migrant workers give up a lot of their skills and qualifications they have merely to earn a pittance to send back to their families. So a lot of these workers are content, I wouldn't say happy as such, to put up with the conditions in which they're living in, and doing the job so that their family in their respective countries can have a better life. And would you agree with that, John? Like a lot of them often forget the conditions because in reality they're doing it to send money back often to their families back home.
Yeah, so similar to what Yasmin said, I've heard stories of migrant workers in Singapore that are actually quite well educated, right? I think one of the stories that struck me most was that there was actually like a literal medical doctor with a legitimate degree that came to Singapore to be a migrant worker because he had a job back where he was, but even working as a migrant construction worker in Singapore paid more than what he would have earned as a doctor there. So
Wow.
I think, yeah, a lot of them aren't just like illiterate or like uneducated, and so they resort to manual labor. It's just that regardless of the conditions here, it is better than what it is back home, and they still earn more here than even if they did like an office job back home.
Yeah, but okay, I acknowledge the fact that the conditions are nicer here. However, we still shouldn't be treating them like subhumans.
No.
When you're in a country, the service that that country provides should be universal. You shouldn't be able to strip it from any person in that country. And if that's clearly not happening. I mean, if you look at our school, for example, I mean,
Yeah.
we don't see it, but they literally, oh my god, like they live
under the buildings.
exactly. They live underneath the buildings. I mean, if you look under there, it is like absolutely like it is inhumane, and that's just the stuff that we see. Imagine what we see when they aren't even in our school.
I mean, yeah, I agree with you there, Sham. As in, like, obviously, I've been on site and I've seen it for the last 4 months. The gardeners, even at the peak of the pandemic, or I don't like to even call them gardeners as such. It's quite condescending, but they've been working almost. They have the longest hours at the school by far. They work from about 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. and they're generally the last to leave, and they're working in the like boiling heat in Malaysia every single day. And I can't imagine the wages that they're on.
And they can't say
the
no.
conditions obviously subhuman, being situated under a building. Like, what does that say about you as a person? Like, that in itself speaks a lot.
And exactly, the state is acknowledging the fact that they can't say no, that they have to earn that money, because it's not just their mouth that they're trying to feed, it's their family's mouth that they're trying to feed as well. And the state acknowledges the fact that it is inelastic, right? And because of that, they can marginalize them as much as they want. They can cut their costs as much as they want, because they know that whatever they do, the workers are still going to have to work for them at the which I think is just horrible.
Do you think we could do something about that? We definitely should have done something about that, Sham, when we were prefects.
I mean, Yasmin, like, the problem is with a lot of these, a lot of the people that work at school, and they're working these really long hours for little pay. I don't know how to describe it, but like, you often approach them, you try and be friendly, and they're just so super skittish. And I don't know what we could do to like improve the conditions at MCM for certain members of staff, because I think this is the harsh reality. The conditions at MCM for these workers is probably better than it is elsewhere in Malaysia, and they're probably getting paid better than elsewhere in Malaysia as well.
Yeah, I guess perhaps like a more humane place to rest in, since like they're all gardeners. I think I remember, Morgan, actually your dad in economics, Mr. Davies, said something along the lines of like how in the UK, like you wouldn't see construction workers like taking a nap in the afternoon or stuff like that. But then in Malaysia, because like the heat is just so hot, and there's a different kind of work ethic, and I think I remember him saying like, sometimes he'd see estate members like taking a quick nap in the afternoon in the that room, the swimming pool place, in front of the sports hall, like sleeping on the floor, which I've witnessed as well. I guess it's a combination of like the different work ethics as opposed to the UK, which honestly I don't know because I've never lived in the UK. But I guess like a simple way to start would be just a better place for them to stay when they need to rest. But I also don't know, like, is the rest hour part of their jobs or no? I don't really know. Yeah. Are they on contracts, or are they... Yeah, like, does our school hire them directly, or is it through another organization?
I actually heard that the school's been doing quite a lot for them. I might have been Abhishek that told me, or someone random, but I heard that they used to live in really cramped rooms together on site. And then about a couple of years ago, Hawkins suggested, and they made the move, and they started renting whole houses for them, and now they get ferried to site every day. So now they live in their own house off site together, versus when they used to be cramped. I don't know who told me that, but yeah.
I think that could be for the estate staff potentially, but for the members of staff that work doing gardening and stuff, there's a workers camp. You know where the Raffles turning is?
Yeah.
on the other side of that road, there's a huge camp for workers, and the conditions in there. I mean,
When you say camp, what do you mean?
as in a camp, as in like really, really poor conditions, crammed into
Right.
one room, corrugated tin or whatever.
Mhm.
But the conditions are squalid completely, and I mean, it's obviously subhuman conditions, probably like some of those which we can see in Singapore right now. But I don't really know what
I
the
think a
solution.
lot of the way we treat them stems from our biases and us treating them like as second-class citizens almost, or like second-class individuals. I
Yeah.
think even in Singapore, even if you weren't wealthy, right? Even if you were middle class, you still considered yourself more powerful and on a higher place in the ladder than a foreign worker. So like no matter how low you were in Singapore, even as a Singaporean cleaner, because you were Singaporean, you still treated a foreign worker with like condescending attitude and stuff like that. So I think a lot of their treatment stems from how much the companies are able to get away with as a result of our own ignorance and biases towards them and our treatment of them.
Yeah, that's completely it. I
Yeah.
agree with.
I agree
Because like
too.
even in Marlborough, like I see the way like the workers interact with the students, right? And they seem almost afraid to talk to
Oh yeah,
students, and they're
100%.
like really like docile and submissive when it's literally a kid and you're like 20 years older than him.
Yeah.
Like just smack him if you have to.
Yeah, but it is the nature of feeling inferior. Like I can't even begin to imagine um, how inferior you must feel to like almost step away from a group of students that are walking that your way. Like I've seen it many a time, as in there'll be a worker working on something and then they'll proceed to move like 5 meters away just so you could walk by and they're out of sight. Or
Yeah, that's
where
horrible.
where do you even begin to make yourself feel that way? Do you know what I mean? Like it's just
Mm.
Okay, and I mean, let's just think like, why does that happen in Malaysia and Singapore, and why are we not seeing that in countries like Australia, UK,
I
US,
think
Canada?
US definitely. It's happening in the US, I think.
US, that's a good point. But I mean, if I look here in Australia, you don't see any of that. Why? Because anyone that comes here can work, and our minimum wage is 60 ringgit an hour if you can convert, which means that literally anyone can work here and
No,
make proper
not just that, but in terms of the social biases and
yeah,
stereotypes of the job itself, like
yeah,
Australia and the UK have their idea of handymans and hard labors are very different to that of an Asian
I
country,
agree.
right?
Yep.
Like in Australia,
I
you
agree.
see a hard laborer, a construction worker, and you think of them as like a normal individual with a normal, respectable job. Whereas in Asia, we normally put
Yeah.
those kinds of jobs down and we think of it as
Yeah.
inferior, and we warn our kids that if they don't study or shit like that, then they move and they get jobs like that.
That is so true. That is
Like,
so true.
so I think it's also how we view and how we stereotype these jobs that allow for the treatment of those workers.
And in Malaysia, there's that hierarchy as well. I mean, what's it called? If you're like really powerful or something, like you get handed that name,
Dato.
yeah, those
Well,
people. Like, if you go over to Australia, all of that means shit. Like, people
yeah.
do not care what your hierarchy is if you're Tansiri or anything like that, because they've created that artificial hierarchy. You know, there's, I mean, John, I mean, that hit the nail on the head. Like, you know, you get looked down upon if you work at a garden or construction or anything like that. And really, that shouldn't be the case.
I mean, in the UK, like migrant workers, you have the two like sides of the argument. Some regard migrant workers as absolute godsends in that they are willing to do the jobs that are often highly looked down upon that people don't want to do, whereas other people, I hate to say it, but less educated people see migrants as people that are coming to our country in their argument, taking our jobs, stealing our money. And it's been a large debate in the UK for a while about the importance of migrant workers and the divide. But I completely agree. Like, migrant workers are coming to the UK and they're taking the jobs that are being left over because people don't want to do them, you know? But without these workers, the economy wouldn't be able to operate in the way that it does, certainly in the UK, because they are like fundamental to upholding the smooth running of the country, the maintenance of the country.
I completely agree. And if there's, when the pandemic kind of started happening globally, the thing we saw most in the news is the frontliners, and realizing that these people, people working at food and beverage chains, cleaners, people doing work on the roads and stuff, like, they're the ones, like Morgan said, building the foundations of our economy. Without it, like, we wouldn't be able to run. And I think perhaps, like, as a side, obviously the pandemic has like a lot of side effects. But I guess perhaps it has also brought light to the fact that the way we treat frontliners and not just like doctors and medical staffers, but the people doing what we would stereotypically consider like low class work, or like, the sort of things we threaten our kids are going to be if they don't study hard. Like, perhaps this whole situation has given us a chance to rethink that and change our own biases. But I haven't heard much talk on that in Malaysia, and I'm not sure about other countries. Like, it's good that Singapore is talking about it and bringing light to this issue.
I mean, I think we could have this conversation and we could really delve into some depth with more research. But I think maybe in the future, this is another topic that we could touch light on, just touch upon, in the future.
Yeah. Oh, just a note on that, John. How is this related to the election? Has it how has it affected the public perception of the PKP or the election generally?
At the start, there was quite a lot of outrage because of the handling, but then it simmered basically. Because, like, the thing is, my honest analysis of it is that not enough people care. Too many people are still stereotyped and biased against them because they deem them as inferior. I see a lot of comments on social media highlighting that their conditions, their jobs, their wages here are better than what they have in their home country, and that they should just suck it up and live and work here. A lot of comments talk about how they're skiving and how COVID's actually a blessing in disguise for them because the government continues paying their wages and then they get free food and stuff like that without working. So I think when the cases happen, there was outrage, and then slowly it simmered, and the stereotype and biases has just prevailed, and it's not going to affect the elections by much, I think.
Right?
Yeah, sadly. And the thing is, I think the handling of it's quite appalling. Like, I think the Minister of Foreign Affairs, her response to the situation was like, I don't think none of the foreign workers have asked for an apology yet. They're grateful and thankful for the support and resources we're giving them and shit like that, without addressing the problems and the issues, which are like the living conditions that they're in.
I think that also the problem is it's always about shifting the blame. Like, every country does it, and I don't know. Like, maybe it's just migrant workers are the easiest option to scapegoat, and completely undermine their role in the country. But again, I don't think Singapore seemingly appreciates the role of migrant workers in the actual running of the country. But again, it's all about changing perceptions and being able to appreciate what these workers have actually done for the country on the whole.
Yeah, I don't think people realize that, like, you look at Singapore as like a city, its buildings, its fancy things, right? And all of it, the roads, the building come from migrant workers.
Oh
And
yeah, 100%.
like you can't take that shit for granted. And you can't, the thing is, right, you can look down on them, you can talk shit about them, and then but then at the same time you can't complain of job loss to them, right? I think
Yeah,
it's one of the most idiotic argument, right? People complain that jobs are being lost to foreigners and that Singaporeans don't have enough jobs, but then they look down on jobs like that.
exactly. That argument pisses me off the most because, like, I do not understand the argument that you're trying to convey. Like, you refuse to do this job, and then someone decides to do that job, which is ultimately fundamental for the country, and then
You still look down on them and talk shit on them.
argue, one, they're inferior to you because of the job they're doing, and two, they're taking the jobs of Singapore citizens. So I really don't get what the argument is, because there is none. Either you do the job or you just shut up and find another job. Do you know what I mean? It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Completely agree. Completely agree.
Wow.
Agreed.
I guess like it all interconnects, doesn't it? Like looking down on the job itself, looking like, does that stem? Yeah, okay. Do we look down on the job because of the job, or do we look down on the job because of the migrant population that's often associated with the job?
Both. I think they dovetail with each other quite well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think, isn't it omnipresent in Malaysia? Not in Malaysia, sorry. It's omnipresent in Asia that to be successful, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to make the wrong statement here, but you have to become a doctor, a lawyer, someone.
So true. Yes, definitely.
I've noticed it myself, which is not always the same in the UK. But I know, like, obviously, like, I have a lot of friends whose parents want them to be a doctor, a lawyer, because if not, they haven't been successful in their lifetime.
Yep, pretty much. And when I tell my relatives now, like, well, I don't mean to boast, but I got into Oxford and I got into Ivy Leagues in the US, and I tell them that I'm going to study, well, in the UK it was theology, in the US I applied for like politics and religion, and they were all like, so are you going to be a lawyer? And I'm like, no, I'm not interested in being a lawyer. I don't know what it is I'm going to be yet. Like, I'm just going to see how it goes. And it's just like, they just always come back. Like, it's just kind of their conception of what is successful, you know?
Morgan, ask me what the proudest thing in my life is.
John, what's the proudest thing in your life?
I'm friends with someone that got into Oxford.
I'm speaking to someone that got into Oxford right now. Privilege.
Yeah, I've actually spent like an hour a week talking to someone who's going to Oxford. Like, can you think of that? Like, how important we are?
The future Prime Minister of Malaysia.
Yeah. Like, I already feel like walking out my door and giving shit to foreign workers. That's how elite I feel talking to someone that's going to Oxford.
Oh god. Yeah, it's a horrible like thing to grow up with, I guess. Thinking that you have to fit in this sort of cookie cutter role to succeed.
Yeah, also, like, if you don't go to a good university, you're going to fail. Like, that is also a statement that I've overheard whilst I've had 2 years in sixth form in Malaysia. Like, if you don't go to one of these top Russell Group universities in the UK or Ivies in the US, then you're not going to make it in life. And I think that's a pointless statement as well in itself. Like, if you have the right mindset, if you really want something, then I think you can get it.
Mm-hmm. Also, Morgan, question, like, in the UK, what is the public perception on like vocational school? If students like finish A-levels or GCSEs and they just want to go to like a vocational school.
What do you mean by vocational?
Like taking up skills and stuff.
Like trade school.
Yeah. Instead of university.
They end up in Asia as foreign workers.
I think it's generally overlooked, to be honest. Like, I've also, like, when I was at my old school, it was always, you have to go to university. You have to. If you don't go to university, then you won't be able to get this job or that job or this job. And like, I don't know. Again, because of my parents' jobs, I've never really been in the state school system. I've always been in the private school system, and every private school wants to have like 100% of our students go to university. You know, it's not about them going to do a tradesman job in, I don't know, carpentry or whatever. Do you know what I mean? It's overlooked in that sense. But yeah,
I think, in Malaysia, there's still sort of like, I don't know if it's just Malay aunties gossiping, but it'll be like, oh, her daughter's going to vocational school, you know, like she's done, like she didn't get into university, like she's not going to university, stuff like that, basically.
It's essentially the same in the UK. Like if you go to a vocational school, which you can potentially do when you finish your GCSEs, instead of doing A levels, you can go to vocational school. You're virtually deemed or regarded as dumb, stupid, not smart enough to do A levels or the international bac. You know, like it's just, again, the perceived preconceived misconception. You know what I mean?
Yeah, completely agree. Yeah, I guess the older generation, I think perhaps like with my parents and my family, like because they've been through such a hard, like tough, like I've been privileged enough to live in an actual, you know, like I don't live in a wooden house, while my mom grew up in a wooden house, and she had a very different upbringing to me. Like she was of like, her family was of lower income than like what she is providing for me, right? So maybe like because the older generation have been through like tougher, quote unquote tougher times than us, that perhaps that's why like in Asia especially, you have to be doctor, you have to be lawyer. These are professions that technically would pay a lot, right? And like engineering is also another field that Malaysian parents are always like, oh, you know, I want my kid to be in science, like in science and engineering, for example. But what I've discovered throughout the past few years, through like, I'm on Twitter a lot, and like a lot of people on Malaysian youth on Twitter have been saying that they graduated with degree in engineering. They get paid like I remember one person tweeted that they got paid 1,800 ringgit per month, and they already have like a degree in engineering, which is pretty low for where he was living in. So in Malaysia, like we're already underpaying the people we want, the profession that like most likely people want. People like in Malaysia, people want their kids to be doctors, but also I think I remember one time reading that there weren't enough, because you know doctors, you have to do residencies and stuff, like you have to do that training period, and there weren't enough spots in the hospital for that either. Yeah, it's just a mess, really.
John, what's success in your household?
To be alive and non-bankrupt by 21.
What do your parents want you to do as a job?
Anything. I'm really lucky. They're fine with anything.
Yeah, reason my parents are fine with me are because they aren't paying anything for my education, because I got a scholarship.
I think the reason why my parents are fine with me is that I've set a really low bar for myself. So for my cousins and stuff, they still expect like, oh, where are you going for uni? What job are you gonna have? But for me, like, oh, you came back home sober tonight. Oh, you didn't lose at poker. Well done. We're proud of you.
Right.
Yeah, but John, like, surely they realize the potential that you have.
Yeah, but they're still not giving me pressure, which I'm thankful for.
Do you think you would have thrived or found it more difficult with pressure?
I think they know that I give myself enough pressure on things. So they tap a bit, but it's not like, wah!
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I think also in Asia generally on the whole, like, there is an overwhelming sense of pressure from parents. Like, that level of stress must be really difficult to cope with.
Definitely. Yeah, and in Asia, everything that you do is well, I can't generalize and say in Asia, but in Malay families especially, everything that you do, everything that I do, it'll be like, oh, it must
I
have
get
been because
compared to
her mom.
everyone.
Okay, yeah, you get compared to everyone, one, but also like people are always like, oh, it's obviously because Anissa and Raza, or like my parents say, like Anissa and Raza like raised their kid like this, so they're like everything I do is automatically a reflection of like, oh, her parents did this, so there she is, and stuff like that.
And one of the things I never got was their comparisons. Like they always compare you to people better and never to
No.
people worse or people on the same
Right?
level as you.
Oh
They're
my
like,
Yeah.
god.
that kid has like 3 PhD and he's a police officer and like flown to Mars like 10 times. Why are you at home?
Yeah, my
Yeah.
mom's always going off about how I'm not religious enough, and I'm like, okay. Yeah, she'll always like, yeah, I think it's just they always compare you to what they want, I suppose. I don't even know. And my mom's favorite threat to my sister is if you don't study hard enough, you're gonna be a cashier at my din. Like that's a joke in our house because she says it so much. My mom says it so much that when we want to joke around with my sister, we're just like, oh, you know, you need to do this because if not, you're gonna be a cashier at my din. Like it's become a joke in this house.
That's lit.
So conclusion.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, I need to conclude. Wait, let me pull up my script.
Just say it's a wrap.
Okay. I quote Zara verbatim, end with a little wrap-up statement, and then just say, if you want to access the resources discussed this episode, please visit our card. Thank you guys for listening.
That's a wrap. Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you.
See you next week.